Well, good evening from Queensland, and I guess it's good morning from Edinburgh or near Edinburgh for Linda Lewin. As our listeners know, a few weeks ago, Linda kindly read parts of her book on the life stories of her grandfather, father, great uncle, and we dealt in that podcast with the fleeing from Burma in 1943 with Linda's grandmother and her father. And so we heard how they escaped and ended up in India. And the one missing question is, what happened to Linda's grandfather? And we know from her book that her father, when he looked back at the wharves in Burma, he knew that he would never see, or likely never see, his father again. So, Linda, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind reading part of your book to explain what happened to Lewin, your grandfather, after your grandmother and father and aunt, I guess, left. Would you mind doing that?
I'd be very happy to do that, Peter, and you're quite right. It's morning time here in Scotland, a rather cold morning. So a little trip down the Irrawaddy is a very nice thought. I was lucky enough to have a few facts from my father and from Auntie Nettie, and I've put that information into this story. Lewin did not spend all his days in court. He wanted to see Western scientific ideas implemented on the family farm, so he read all the latest books and invested in irrigation and drainage schemes. Swamps became dry land, freshwater wells were dug, mangrove trees were cleared and replaced with new paddy fields. He introduced a pineapple crop and teased his wife not to enjoy too many fruits of the land. Every year, more and more boatloads of paddy were delivered to the steam-powered rice mills. The paddy was unloaded by day labourers from the villages, barefoot men deprived of land, who lived by the weight they carried on their bare backs. They submitted silently to climb the milling machines, balancing on rickety steps, bending double under the weight of rice, pouring sack after sack into the vibrating, open-mouthed engines, which never slowed their mechanical pace. The noise and dust and hardship were colossal, but there was no shortage of labour. Somewhere in the depths of the mill, caught between the sieves, belts and pulleys, the brown-skinned paddy turned into never-ending rivers of polished white rice. Every sack of best quality paddy sold to the mill was noted in Boh Ma's account book and added to her profits. The Baptist missionaries taught that prayers are rewarded and God will bring prosperity to the just men, but in our land of plenty, God struggled to hear poor men's voices because there was just too much of a greedy clamour. From Lewin's point of view, the successful order of life collapsed on that dreadful day when news of the Japanese invasion arrived in his office. His first thought was of Lucienne and the children. It seemed to him that all he had worked for, everything he believed permanent, including the rule of law and order, was revealed as flimsy as the Christmas lanterns the children hung around the house and garden. Lucienne was busy making final preparations for her traditional Boxing Day party, and the maid was rocking his new baby in a hammock on the veranda. What could he say to Lucienne? He had promised she'd be safe in their new house by the lake, and she had believed him. The foreigners' war in Europe had turned to a war in Asia, flown around the globe and landed monstrous, bloody and screaming in Rangoon. The white-faced figures of authority were caught out, all unprepared. They immediately dispatched their wives and families on the last planes and watched them sail away on the last boats, counting themselves lucky to escape with their lives. Their servants, abandoned, left to the mercy of the invaders, or to make their way up country by any means possible, on barefoot if necessary. The Japanese delivered their New Year message to Bassein by way of pretty printed invitations, paper gnats fluttering from the sky, nipping at the people's ears, whispering, "Asia unite! Freedom rises with the sun in the east. Asia unite." Our freedom-fighting Burmese brothers joined with the Imperial Army and threatened to come marching down the delta any day. Every man, woman and child must look out for themselves, because there was no one left to do it for them. Friends and neighbours remembered old quarrels and took knives to each other's throats. A young man was shot dead at the crossroads. People abandoned their homes and took to the roads, carrying nothing but fear in their hearts. Lewin knew he could not keep Lucien or his foreigner children safe in Bassein, but neither could he make the awful decision to part from them. He set his papers in order and wrote a letter for Lucien, leaving it on his office desk along with his gold signet ring. Lucien must give the ring to Boh Lay when the time was right. He locked the office door as usual when he was away from home and gave Lucien the key, saying it was harvest time and he had important business to attend to in the village. It was a gallant action. There was no petrol, so he took Boh Lay's bicycle. On that terrible night, when the bombs were falling and the town went up in flames like a furnace, Lucienne remembered her father. She watched him march off to war with a battalion of men who promised to fight a war to end all wars. So few returned. She crossed oceans to put her memories to rest, to laugh and dance with her husband and children in a faraway country. Her life, which had begun in one war, threatened to end in another. She would rather have died alongside Lewin than give him up, but that choice was never hers to make. Necessity forged her courage, a mother's courage to protect her children. It drained her heart's blood. Lewin had left her, so she could leave him. He knew she would do the unbearable right thing for the children's sake. That terrible night, floating away on the ebb tide with a new baby in her arms, she left her husband and the best part of her life on the wharf. My darling gazelles, it is sad to say, there are brave birds of passage who fly thousands of miles without coming to harm. But however strong and resilient they may be, they cannot fly against the wind. They must accept their fate. Prayers went unanswered. The ancient pagoda proved to be nothing more than a convenient beacon for the Japanese bombers. It suffered a direct hit in the days following Boh Lay's departure. The golden mirage lay shattered in the dust, with its feet of clay exposed. Looters scraped away at the bricks, helping themselves to the precious gold fragments. An upturned cart and the bloated bodies of 2 horses blocked the entrance steps. Lewin continued to do his faithful duty. When an air raid set the tobacco warehouses on fire, Lewin directed his men to pour water on the flaming buildings. And when they ran out of petrol for the pumps and hoses, they broke locks and requisitioned supplies from the last petrol store in town. And when even that supply ran out, they risked their lives with chain gangs and buckets. They fought until there was nothing left to save. In the short space of a few days, Warehouses, shops, and tree-lined streets were reduced to sheets of blackened corrugated iron and fragments of charred wood. The skeleton of Boh Lay's bicycle remained leaning against a brick wall, but the tires and handlebars were melted away to nothing. Debris and ashes rolled away on the outgoing tide, only to return with the incoming tide. Lewin had one remaining task. He signed the order, releasing the starving convicts from the prison. It was his last official act. Guilty men were set free to roam the streets and fight the scavenger dogs for food. Lewin's mentor, Sansi Po, the man who had given him his good name, stood unarmed on the road to Rangoon and called on the Japanese invaders to spare the women and children. For the moment, they agreed to respect an old man's sincere wishes. Lewin returned home, expecting to find the house empty, but Aung too was waiting for him. The kitchen fire was lit, rice was cooked, and warm water prepared in the bathroom, just as Lucien liked it. Aung too took a cloth. He washed his master's scalded body like a parent tending a child, and wrapped gauze bandages around Lewin's burnt hands. Lewin imagined he could hear Boh Lay chanting his homework. He went upstairs and paced around the empty rooms. The baby cot stood waiting with a mosquito net ready to unfurl. The children's sandals were laid out neatly with their green and white school uniforms and books on the shelf. Lewin stroked his hand over the fine foreigner clothes in his dressing room, the best linen and tweed any man could buy. He could see his face in his beautifully polished shoes, but he could not bear to think of inserting his tender feet into the leather prisons. He pushed aside the evening suit and the horsehair wig and gown, which Lucien had maintained so carefully with brushing every week, and picked up an old, coloured lungi like the one his father wore in the fields. Aung too knotted it firmly around his master's waist. The night was cool. Lewin crossed the pretty canal, otherwise known as the foul drainage ditch, remembering where Boh Lay had narrowly escaped drowning. He felt himself breaking into a fever. His head and bones ached. He walked down to the white-painted bridge beside the wharf, where Aung too liked to buy bread from the Indian baker. Everywhere deserted. He considered he might be the last person left alive in town, but no. A boy pushing a bicycle appeared on the bridge, walking towards him, and pulled at his lungi, refusing to let go. The boy was smaller than Boh Lay, and the bicycle was too large. Perhaps he had borrowed it from Boh Lay. He was too young to be out alone, but he seemed to understand Lewin's needs. Without speaking, he escorted Lewin to a ferry boat, and Lewin appreciated his help. Sampo Lewin was the oldest son and first in everything, including death. Lewin breathed his last in the place where he was born. Perhaps he died of typhoid after fighting the fire when Bassein was turned to ashes. I say he died because his faithful heart was broken. But your Auntie Nettie said he died from eating a pork curry cooked by his unlucky sister. What nobody can say is where Dolbu Ma and Utan La buried their best beloved son. Many years later, Boh Lay told me, with the slightest pain of resentment in his voice, nobody ever told him anything, but when his father turned the bicycle round the corner by the white bridge over the pretty canal, he knew that would be the last he saw of him.
That's beautifully written, Linda. Beautifully written. Thank you so much for reading those words.
Well, thank you, Peter.
So, Linda, I wondered if we could now turn to talking about your great uncle, Sanpo Tin, because from what I understand, the two brothers were very, very different. And perhaps you could start by talking about that difference, and then we'll head to talking about his early life. And it was quite different to your grandfather. So let's start with the difference between the two boys.
Well, it seems that my grandfather, Sampo Lewin, was a very sensible, studious, hardworking type. He took the straightforward route through life, but Sampo Thin, slightly younger, much more impetuous, emotional, equally clever. Sampo Thin seemed to have a huge amount of energy, which perhaps was a little bit difficult to hold in check. So I used those two brothers to mirror the situation in the country. People were starting to think about independence and how would that be achieved? Would the Japanese be one route towards independence, or would the British cooperate and grant independence? It was a very precarious, unpredictable situation. And unfortunately, because my grandfather, the oldest son, had died, Sampo Thin stepped into his place. And from Sampo Thin's own grandchildren, I said, what was the truth about his life? And they said, we just don't know. There are so many stories. Even they claimed he was the first man to hijack an aeroplane. And there was apparently there was a hijacking. I researched that. I couldn't find Sampo Thin's name mentioned, but he was actually very clever in not being mentioned because, that is a way of avoiding unfortunate consequences. So Sampo Thin was a great survivor in these really tricky times of Burma's move towards independence.
But you know the expression, I'm off to join the circus. I found that quite extraordinary. And perhaps you could talk about how he got to that.
Well, there was a great missionary school in Bassein run by American Baptists. Sampo Thin was picked out by one of the missionaries, a Dr. Nicol, and he traveled with Dr. Nicol first to London and then on to America to study music. Music, was one of the Baptist talents, really. He had, I think, he was a young man growing up, impetuous. He had some romantic difficulties, was feeling a little bit down when he spotted a poster from Barnum and Bailey Circus advertising the white elephant, and he realized that he knew Dr. Po Min, he knew the boys who were accompanying the elephant, so he ran off from school to see them and was immediately offered a job as frontman. Sampo Thin had the gift of the gab, so it was very natural that he would be frontman presenting the elephant to the American audiences. And I think he traveled with the circus for several months before perhaps he calmed down a little bit and returned to his studies.
His studies in English, sorry, in America, or did he come?
He returned to the Baptist school in America, and he did eventually achieve his bachelor's degree in music. And at that point, he returned to Burma feeling rather pleased with himself.
This was pre-Second World War.
This was all pre-Second World War in the 1920s. Having gained his degree, he took up a teaching post and he started a business in the school making toys so the students could fund themselves. This was a very successful little business, apparently, and so the school's inspector promoted him to go to art college in London to study in craft and industry. He arrived in London all set up to do that. By this time, we were really just approaching the eve of the Second World War. Everything was up in the air again. Sampo Thin, curious as always, and nothing deterred him, decided to make a quick visit to Berlin and attended a rally in front of the Opera House, got a close-up view of Hitler and had lunch with some of the Germans afterwards. And they said to him, look, it's about time you got out from under the boot of the British. Why don't you start a revolt? Sampo Thin wasn't very pleased with this idea. He is writing much later in life, but he claims he could see bloodshed on the horizon. And, perhaps he was farsighted. And he was, as I said, an intelligent man. He could see war coming, and he returned to Burma at that point.
Who did he join then to fight?
Now I have a little bit more research to do on this point. He was a senior Karen. He did lead, I don't know what you would call it, a battalion, a unit of Karen men who fought on the British side. He was actually captured by the Japanese at one point. He had to tread very carefully. I suppose essentially he was fighting for the Karen people and their well-being in the midst of all these opposing forces. So at the end of the war, he sided with General Aung San and the move towards independence from the British.
So perhaps at this point you could read a little bit from, I think it's page 181, about what both your uncle Sampo Tin wanted and your grandfather Sampo Lewin wanted. You talk about what they wanted for the country and for the Karen people. And in particular, there's an event that shortly takes place where, again, your great uncle really, just by, I don't know whether you'd say luck, but he avoided being assassinated in the horrible events in 1947 when Aung San was assassinated. I think your uncle was on his way, great uncle was on his way to meet Aung San. So perhaps if you could just read a little bit, which also shows the difference between the two brothers on page 181.
Okay, then that's fine. Uncle Thin and Lewin both wanted to make prosperous and peaceful dreams come true for their Karen people. But that was not a straightforward thing. Lewin remained steadfast and loyal to the British Empire right up until his last breath, whereas Uncle Thin preferred independence. Independence for Burma and prosperity for the Karen people in Burma. Uncle Thin fought bravely for his principles all through the Japanese occupation, but not everything he had done or how he had risked his life for the British officers was known to the public. In the end, it had taken all his courage to march into the Burma General Aung San's office with the words, "Sometimes your greatest enemy can become your greatest friend." But Aung San understood perfectly. After all, the general had supported the Japanese to eject the British and then supported the British in order to eject the Japanese. All is fair in love and war. War compelled soldiers and politicians to take devious paths, and there were many unsung heroes. Uncle Thin wished his brother was there to approve the course he was taking. He was ambitious for himself and his country, and he was ready to lay aside his British uniform along with his Japanese sword in exchange for a business suit. That morning he wore modern European style, a man to be taken seriously. If the country lay in ruins, he intended to be one who would rebuild it, and if necessary, he would be ruthless in the application of common sense. His Karen comrades called him a traitor when he accepted a ministerial post from the Burma General Aung San, but nonetheless he was on his way to a meeting in the Secretariat where he had an appointment to keep with the future cabinet members, and he would have preferred not to be late. His mind returned to the present when he heard the sound of the ferry engines manoeuvring towards the wharf and caught the whiff of garlic and fish paste from the mohinga stalls. The boatmen were poised with the mooring ropes in hand. At 10:30 it was already more than halfway through the morning, so he would engage a taxi to make up for lost time. A familiar sound came pattering over the rooftops of the foreign embassies and grand hotels, falling to the ground between the market stalls on the wharf. No one else seemed to hear it. It was not loud enough to disturb the mothers and children doing their shopping, or the unemployed men playing board games with bottle tops on the pavement, but it was loud enough to alert Uncle Thin, who knew it from old. Loud enough to alert a man whose life-saving good luck depended on his quick wits. Sampo Thin arrived at the Secretariat building just in time to experience the spellbound moment of silent paralysis which precedes earth-shattering events, such as great storms or earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. In that moment, the history of our country cleaved apart and realigned, changing course forever. The spell was broken by a white hanky fluttering from a window. Uncle Thin walked across the lawn and entered the grand hall just as all hell broke loose. In an unforgettably beautiful shaft of green light pouring down from the cupola, a cascade of men in uniform, disordered, undisciplined, screaming, came tumbling down the cast-iron spiral staircase. The bloody bodies followed, some few on stretchers, but most wrapped in blankets and carried in the arms of their comrades. Nobody noticed or questioned Uncle Thin. He found his way to the meeting room where he should have been an hour earlier. It was a utilitarian office, the type familiar to any boarding school boy or waiting room passenger in an English railway station. A notice on the dimpled glass door politely reminded passers-by to be quiet. Executive Council meeting in progress. Heavy wooden tables arranged in a horseshoe and square high-backed chairs remained in place on the linoleum floor. There were maps and charts on the wall as if prepared for an elementary geography lesson, but that was the end of anything that could be called ordinary. The room was ripped to pieces, gun smoke hanging in the air, loose papers fluttering, bullet holes sprayed across the walls and ceiling. all the country's best hopes for the future were assassinated on that morning. 6 government ministers, a secretary, a bodyguard, and the charismatic leader Aung San, with 13 bullets in his body. All this would be written up in the newspapers next morning. On the 19th of July 1947, Aung San was chairing a meeting of his Executive Council at the main Secretariat building in Rangoon when 3 gunmen with Sten guns burst in a little after 10:30 a.m. and opened fire. Aung San stood up when he heard the commotion outside, and he was the first one to be felled by the hail of indiscriminate gunfire. He was 31 years old. Many years later, when sometimes it seemed as if almost everyone of any merit had either died or emigrated for a better life abroad, and the youth and strength of the country was drained away to foreign economies, Uncle Finn was one exception. He had spent time in prison and been released. He had navigated and survived all the difficult times and provided for his family. His wife was handsomely plump and his daughters elegant. At last he was left in peace to enjoy his children and play with his grandchildren, attending their university graduation ceremonies with pride. Sometimes, in the afternoon, if he answered the telephone, it might be a call from Aung San's widow, Daw Kin Chi, requesting him to tune her piano. Uncle Finn would go up to the widow's house by the lake for tea and talk in her quiet sitting room. They enjoyed the late afternoon sun and the slight, cool breeze from the open windows. He admired her family photographs and made her smile by singing the songs that hardly anyone except themselves remembered, and talked about the old days when their children were young, and he made Suu Kyi laugh by carrying her on his back, pretending to be an elephant with a long trunk. So there you have it.
Yeah, you write so beautifully. I'm sure all the listeners will be amazed at how you actually can picture what is happening at the time and what he experienced in that horrible day of July 1947. But he clearly was a real character, Uncle Tin. You don't know what happened, the prison bit, do you? You haven't been able to dig down to find out why he went to prison.
I do have a collection of articles written by San Pathein, and I'm still digging my way through them to try and find out what exactly went on. But as I said, I have luckily had the opportunity to visit all of these places, and that helped me a lot in writing about them. But when I asked family members, what do you remember? Sometimes they were a little bit vague, and even, as I said, San Pathein's own grandchildren found it hard to distinguish fact from fiction.
Well, it sounds like a lot of his life was, almost like one of those adventure novels.
Absolutely. But as many of the facts as I can manage to check, they do bear out the truth of the stories I've heard.
Do you know when he
Amazingly.
passed away? Just
I
yeah.
think he passed away in the 70s. He did live to be a good old age. Yeah.
Hopefully, we've got a few more years, Linda. Would he have been in his 80s?
Yes,
80s.
yes.
Yeah.
Um, I'm very glad to have Karen genes in my blood. They're pretty tough, and yeah, a lot of them live good, long lives as long as they don't get shot along the way.
And so your dad never went back to Burma before his great or his uncle passed away. Is that correct?
No, unfortunately not. My father didn't go back until 2014,
That was with
uh,
you, right?
and that was with me. And we met almost all of his cousins who were already in their 70s by then. We just missed meeting the last of the previous generation, my father's parents' generation. We just missed them.
Mm. And did Uncle Din marry once or?
Well, I believe, as was perfectly common, he married once, but he lived through a war, he went to prison, he went into exile at one time, and he did return from one of his trips to Thailand with a baby daughter who who was accepted into the family, um, very generously accepted into the family. This I think was not a unusual occurrence in Burma at that time.
Sure.
So so these children often they are great treasures, and
So,
so he had one wife, but he was a charming man.
right.
So no
So
doubt.
Nessie, is it Nessie who you talk about?
Auntie Nettie was one of his daughters,
Right.
um, who who hero worshipped her father, and she gave me a lot of stories about that time, about her father. Auntie Nettie really was my mentor in Burma, and if only I'd understood a little bit more, if only I'd had a little bit more background history at the time, it might have made more sense. But anyway, she was very close, and she did give me a lot of details, which I've put into the book.
Well, Linda, I'd like to congratulate you on the book, and I heartily recommend it to any of the people who've listened to the two podcasts on your grandfather and father, and also on your great uncle. If you, in due course, dig up more interesting information about your great uncle, please let's get in touch and look to do another podcast about what you've dug up. But as I say, I thank you for your time and for the wonderful way you've written this book, and I'm sure all our listeners have enjoyed it as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure, and all of these stories are precious. I do hope people enjoy them.
Thank you.